What if the late fee you owed was nothing but a tool of humiliation? That's what a black man faced when his HOA demanded payment with smug grins, certain they had him cornered. Their smiles collapsed when he settled the debt in full, by buying the very office they worked in. Imagine this, a quiet suburban street where fences cast long, unbroken shadows, stretching farther than the eye dares to admit. These fences look harmless, painted white and neatly trimmed, but their meaning runs deeper. They divide, they exclude, they whisper a language of separation without speaking a single word. Marcus stands at his mailbox holding a plain envelope. To anyone passing by, it's routine. A bill, a reminder, nothing extraordinary. But for him, the weight inside is heavier than the paper itself. His neighbor across the street waters his lawn, eyes flicking for just a moment before turning away. Silence lingers thicker than the afternoon heat. He tears the envelope open. A demand for late fees dressed in formal words. It reads like policy but feels like punishment, Karen says at a past meeting. Rules don't bend for renters. Marcus mutters at the mailbox. Then maybe your records are broken. The fence across the street seems taller today. Its shadow stretches across his shoes as if reminding him where he's allowed to stand and where he isn't. The letter lands on his kitchen table, its white edges glowing against the wood. To the HOA, it's just paper. To Marcus, it's history repeating itself. His father's voice echoes in memory, words carried through time. They'll always hide behind paper, son, because paper doesn't flinch when it hurts you. The ink doesn't just demand money, it demands obedience. Words like failure to comply are daggers dipped in politeness. The letter is less about dollars than about dignity. He sees his father again sitting on their porch decades earlier, recounting battles with red-lined banks, unjust property lines, endless denials. His father once said, "They don't need chains when they've got signatures." Marcus exhales slowly. The silence of his home grows louder, until even the hum of the fridge feels like judgment. Outside, neighbors pass by his window, their heads lowering as if the envelope were contagious. No one asks. No one speaks. The silence becomes a neighbor of its own, constant, complicit, and loyal only to power. Behind closed doors, the HOA gathers. The board sits around a polished table, pens lined neatly beside coffee cups. Their voices are calm, but their confidence carries arrogance. Another reminder to Marcus, one says. If he doesn't pay, we escalate. Another nods. We can always file a lien. Rules are rules. Their polished shoes tap lightly against tiled floors, each sound as deliberate as their words. They believe themselves untouchable, draped in the armor of procedure. For them, it's not personal, but that's the cruelty. It's never personal, yet it always lands that way. Marcus knows their faces well. He's seen them smile in driveways, wave at block parties, but when they step into that office, they become something else. Guardians of rules written in ink, not in fairness. He wonders if they even notice how easily their words can wound, or if the silence of the neighborhood convinces them their power is natural. The sky darkens early that evening, clouds gathering with a weight that feels familiar. The storm hasn't broken yet, but the air hums with electricity. Marcus feels it pressing against his skin, the same way he feels the HOA's eyes following him through paperwork and whispers. Another letter arrives. The words are colder, sharper. The amount owed grows, as if inflated by arrogance. He doesn't crumble it. He folds it neatly, places it beside the first. One by one, these papers pile up like stacked judgments, fragile in form but heavy in meaning. Karen's voice echoes again, smug from the last meeting. The rules don't care about feelings. Marcus whispers to himself, placing the letter down. Neither do I. Outside, the fences glow faintly under porch lights. They no longer look like boundaries of property. They look like walls of exclusion. Each plank another reminder of where the lines are drawn and who is expected to stay behind them. Neighbors tuck themselves into their houses. Curtains close. Televisions flicker. Yet the silence lingers like fog. It is the kind of silence that fuels authority, the kind that whispers don't get involved. Marcus sits at his table staring at the stack of letters. The storm outside finally breaks, thunder rolling low like a warning. Raindrops slide down his window, tracing lines that look eerily like bars. He feels the weight of centuries condensed into envelopes, the kind of weight designed to bend a man slowly, letter by letter. But he doesn't bend. Not yet. Not ever. He straightens the stack, presses his palm against it, and allows himself a single, steady thought. This isn't about late fees. This is about ownership. This is about dignity. The night deepens. The fences drip with rain, their shadows broken by lightning. Marcus exhales again, not with defeat but with a quiet, unshakable patience. The HOA thinks they've set the stage, but what they don't know is that Marcus has been watching. He has been listening, and he has already decided. This storm will not wash him away. It will clear the ground for something greater. The storm outside had passed, but its echo lingered in Marcus's chest. The morning sun rose with deceptive warmth, painting the cul-de-sac in calm light. Yet calm is often a disguise. In his mailbox, another envelope waited. He knew its weight before he even touched it. He slid it open with his thumb. The language was sharper this time, the numbers bolder. Failure to comply will result in further penalties. The words felt less like administration and more like a threat dressed in polite font. Karen's voice returned to him in memory, sharp as glass. Rules don't bend for renters. He spoke quietly to the paper. Maybe it's time the rules snapped. The envelopes kept arriving, each one thinner than the truth it claimed to hold, but heavier in meaning. Marcus stacked them on his kitchen counter. To the HOA, they were just letters. To him, they were weapons, and he was keeping count. Whispers began to drift across fences. At first, soft and uncertain, like breezes slipping through cracks in the wood. "Did you hear about Marcus?" One voice muttered near the mailbox row. "They're saying he's months behind." Another voice chimed in, hushed but cutting. "He should just pay. Why cause trouble?" Marcus heard them, though they never spoke directly to him. Silence was safer than solidarity. Fear was a neighbor. In this community, living rent-free in every house. Walking down the street, Marcus noticed eyes glancing, then darting away. The fences seemed taller every day, each one a barrier not just of property but of conscience. People folded newspapers, adjusted garden hoses, pretended they didn't see. Their silence became the HOA's loudest ally. Inside the HOA office, behind closed doors, the board discussed strategy. The air smelled of coffee and ink. They sat with a confidence earned not by justice but by procedure. "His payments are late. We can escalate," one board member said. Another smirked. "Lie in the property. That'll wake him up." Karen leaned back, tapping her pen against the table. "If he resists, we'll make an example." Their words didn't need volume. Authority is often quiet, like a knife drawn in the dark. Marcus, however, wasn't blind to the pattern. He began watching more closely. One neighbor left their trash bins out for days, no fine. Another painted their front door bright blue, clearly outside the approved color list. No notice. Yet Marcus received letter after letter for the smallest details. A garden hose coiled slightly out of place. A car parked with its tire inches beyond the line. The rules weren't broken. They were bent, and bent always toward him. He started taking notes, dates, times, photographs. Every infraction ignored when committed by others. Every paper sent when his name appeared on the list. The evidence grew like a second stack of letters, one not meant to wound him but to protect him. At night, when the neighborhood was quiet, Marcus remembered his father's words. "They'll always hide behind paper, but remember, you can write too." He smiled faintly, pen in hand, documenting what the HOA hoped no one would notice. The whispers over fences didn't stop. Some grew bolder. "Why doesn't he just move?" One woman muttered to her husband, not realizing Marcus could hear from his yard. "He's making it worse for himself." but not all voices condemned. A different neighbor, older, whispered quietly when no one else could hear. "I see what they're doing. Keep your head high." It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But it was a crack in the silence. And cracks, Marcus knew, spread. One evening, after another envelope arrived with a threat highlighted in bold, Marcus took a photo. He posted it online. Just a simple caption. "Selective enforcement. Same rules. Different standards." At first, the post went almost unnoticed. A few comments, a handful of likes, but then someone shared it. And another. Soon, strangers began commenting. "Looks exactly like what happened in my HOA. They target who they want. That's how they keep control." The fight was no longer confined to his mailbox. It had stepped beyond the cul-de-sac, beyond the fences. The HOA didn't yet realize it, but their quiet war had entered the noisy world of the internet. Still, in his neighborhood, silence reigned. Most residents avoided eye contact. Fear gripped tighter than compassion. But a few, just a few, started to approach him cautiously. At the grocery store, a neighbor leaned in, voice low. "Is it true? They fined you for a hose being out?" Marcus nodded. "Documented and dated." The neighbor frowned. "That's ridiculous." Then they glanced around, making sure no one had heard, and walked away quickly. The silence of the majority was still suffocating, but it no longer felt unbreakable. The storm was swelling. Inside the HOA office, Karen reviewed the files with growing irritation. "He's building a case," she muttered. A fellow board member shrugged. "So what? No one will side with him. He's just one man." Karen tapped. Her pen, the sound sharp. One man with proof is more dangerous than silence. Marcus obtained more than proof. Through careful persistence, he found meeting notes, dry, mundane records that the board assumed no one cared to read. But hidden, within were discrepancies. Decisions made in private, funds allocated suspiciously, fines inconsistently applied. The corruption wasn't small, it was systemic. The stack of papers on Marcus's table grew. On one side, the HOA's threats. On the other, his evidence. Together they told a story, not of a late fee, but of a structure built on fear, silence, and selective enforcement. And still, the silence in the neighborhood weighed heavy. Neighbors averted their eyes. Conversations ended abruptly when Marcus walked by. The crowd, as a character, was not yet with him. They lingered in the gray area, of complicity, their fear louder than their morality. But Marcus could feel it. Something was shifting. Silence can hold, but only until the storm arrives. And Marcus knew. The storm was close. The silence pressed harder with each passing day. Marcus felt it in the way neighbors turned their backs at the mailbox, in the way curtains twitched when he walked his dog. It wasn't just avoidance, it was fear made visible. Fear of being associated with him. Fear of the HOA's quiet wrath. At night, he sat at his table surrounded by papers, both theirs and his. One stack was meant to break him. The other was meant to break them. He stared at the two piles, wondering which one would speak louder when the moment came. The HOA didn't stop. Another envelope arrived, the language sharpened to a blade. Immediate action required. Failure to resolve will result in legal escalation. The words pretended to be neutral, but Marcus knew better. Karen's voice haunted him from the last board meeting, smug and cutting. "The rules don't care about feelings." Marcus whispered into the quiet of his home. "Neither do facts." The storm in his chest grew. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus stood by his fence as two neighbors chatted nearby. Their voices carried just enough for him to hear. "He should just pay and move on," one said. "It's not worth fighting them," the other added. Marcus leaned against the fence, eyes steady. He didn't say a word, but the silence between them became heavier than the gossip itself. They glanced his way, then fell silent, embarrassed by their own cowardice. Still, a few cracks widened. A woman named Linda approached him one evening, her voice hushed, glancing around as though spies hid in the hedges. I don't agree with what they're doing, she admitted. I got the same notice last year, but they dropped it when I complained. I think they're targeting you. Marcus nodded. Document it. If you have anything, save it. Linda hesitated, then whispered, Be careful. They don't like people who push back. Her warning carried more weight than her words intended. Fear still wrapped around the neighborhood like barbed wire. Marcus didn't just rely on whispers. He dug deeper. He attended meetings, requested records. What he found was worse than expected. Fines issued inconsistently, funds redirected without explanation, board decisions made in private and hidden from residents. It wasn't just him. It was everyone. But the board had chosen him as the example, the one they thought would bend. They mistook patience for weakness. He posted another image online, this time of 2 letters side by side, his violation notice and a photo of a neighbor's unpunished infraction. The caption was sharp. Same street, same rule, 2 outcomes. The post spread quickly. Comments flooded in. Classic HOA corruption. They always target who they think won't fight back. Expose them. The digital world was waking even if the physical street still slept in silence. Inside the boardroom, the unease grew. Karen flipped through files, irritated. He's putting this online. One member scoffed. That won't matter. Strangers on the internet don't vote here. Karen's eyes narrowed. But neighbors watch the internet too. Silence cracks when people see injustice in the open. Marcus walked his dog one evening as the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the cul-de-sac. A group of neighbors gathered near the mailbox. As he approached, the conversation stopped. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then one man cleared his throat. Marcus, he said cautiously, is it true they fined you for your garden hose? Yes, Marcus replied simply. That's ridiculous, the man muttered, shaking his head. A few others nodded faintly. No one said more, but the air felt different. The silence was beginning to fracture. That night, Marcus dreamed of his father again. He saw him younger, standing in front of a bank desk, being told he didn't qualify. Papers stamped with denials. His father turned in the dream, his voice steady. They'll always try to write you out. But remember, son, you can write them out too. Marcus woke with the words still echoing. He looked at the stack of evidence on his table and realized it was no longer just defense. It was ammunition. The HOA didn't know it yet, but the stage was being set. The storm was no longer in the distance. It was gathering right above them. When the next letter arrived, this one a formal summons to a public hearing, Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. He placed it neatly atop the pile and whispered, Perfect. The neighbors may have thought the hearing was just another performance of authority, another ritual where the board reminded everyone who held the pen. But Marcus knew better. A hearing was not just their stage. It was his chance to flip the script. As the day drew near, whispers spread again, but this time with a different tone. He's going to fight them. They're going to embarrass him. No, I heard he has proof. The crowd as a character began to shift, uneasy, uncertain of which side to trust. The fences still stood, tall and silent, but even they seemed less certain now, their shadows fractured by the shifting light of doubt. Marcus prepared. He organized his notes, his photos, his evidence. The pile of papers that once weighed him down now felt like armor. For every letter they sent to break him, he had another page to break them. On the night before the hearing, thunder rolled again, low and steady. Marcus stood at his window, staring at the office building where the board would gather. It looked small, fragile even, like an empty shell. Soon, he thought, it would be more than a symbol of their power. Soon, it would be his. He closed his eyes and whispered the words that had carried him through every storm. This isn't about late fees. This is about ownership. This is about dignity. The silence outside still held, but Marcus could feel it. The storm had arrived. And in the morning, silence itself would be forced to speak. The day of the hearing arrived with the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The neighborhood looked unchanged, lawns trimmed, cars polished, mailboxes standing straight. But beneath the surface, unease simmered. The notice of the hearing had spread through the cul-de-sac, drawing whispers, speculation, even anticipation. Marcus dressed carefully, not in defiance, not in flash, but with quiet precision. A pressed shirt, dark jacket, steady shoes. He wanted no one to say he looked careless, no one to twist his appearance into their weapon. His armor was dignity. As he walked toward the HOA office, neighbors peeked through curtains. Some whispered behind closed doors, others stood on porches, pretending to water plants but really watching. Their silence was louder than words. The office loomed small but rigid, a symbol of control. Its doors, once unremarkable, now seemed like the gates of a stage. Marcus stepped inside. The room was arranged with cold deliberation. A long table elevated the board, their chairs higher, their vantage superior. Marcus's seat sat lower, centered, in front of them like a defendant before judges. Around the edges, neighbors filled the chairs, their expressions mixed: curiosity, judgment, unease. The crowd was present not as witnesses of fairness, but as silent reinforcement of authority. The gavel struck. Karen sat at the head, eyes sharp. "This hearing will now begin." The sound echoed too long, like thunder in a small valley. Pens were uncapped, papers shuffled. The performance of control had started. Marcus glanced at the crowd. Their silence felt heavy, but beneath it he sensed cracks, eyes that lingered too long on him, whispers that quieted mid-sentence. The stage was theirs, but he was not without an audience. Karen spoke first, her tone clipped. "Mr. Marcus, you have repeatedly failed to pay your late fees. You have ignored reminders, warnings, and now face escalation. Do you understand the seriousness of your violation?" Marcus looked at her steadily. "I understand the seriousness of selective enforcement." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes narrowed. "This is not about enforcement. This is about compliance. Rules apply equally to all." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but edged. "Do they?" The question hung heavy. Pens scratched against paper, each stroke like a verdict being written before the case was heard. Another board member adjusted his glasses. "We're not here to debate fairness, sir. We're here to address your refusal to comply." Marcus let silence stretch before replying. "Fairness isn't a debate, it's the point." Gasps slipped from the crowd. Whispers began to stir. For the first time, the room's silence was broken not by the board, but by those watching. Resident near the back lifted a phone discreetly. The lens caught the posture of the board, the imbalance of power, the pens scratching in unison. Clips would soon slip beyond these walls. The HOA didn't know it, but their stage was no longer private. Karen tapped the gavel. "Control your tone, Mr. Marcus." Marcus met her gaze. "Control your bias." The crowd reacted, a few stifled laughs breaking through, quickly smothered by nervous glances. Karen's cheeks tightened. She shifted to paperwork, shuffling, as though the documents could shield her from the fracture in silence. The hearing pressed on, each board member speaking as though rehearsed. They recited fines, violations, dates. Their words dripped with neutrality, but their tone carried disdain. Marcus listened, letting them stack their arguments high, waiting until the weight was unbearable. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out his own stack of papers. The room stilled. He laid them on the table carefully, one page after another, the sound sharp in the silence. "Here," he said evenly, "are your rules. Here are the dates you ignored them. Here are the fines you overlooked when others broke them. Here are the funds redirected without consent, every signature, every discrepancy." The board froze. Karen's pen slipped against the paper, leaving a crooked line. The crowd leaned forward. Whispers grew louder. Gasps punctuated the air. The documents were not arguments. They were proof. Marcus's voice remained steady. You wanted to talk about compliance. Let's talk about yours. The silence shattered. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some residents covering their mouths in disbelief, others shaking their heads at the board. The weight of years of silence pressed back against its makers. Karen struck the gavel hard. Order! Order in this room! But the sound no longer commanded control. It sounded desperate, brittle, hollow. Marcus continued, unwavering. For months you've hidden behind paper thinking it would silence me, but paper works both ways, and today it speaks louder than your gavel. The crowd reacted with a sharp intake of breath as if the very walls had cracked. A resident whispered too loudly, He's right. I got fined for nothing while they ignored others. Another added, I knew it. The tide shifted. Silence no longer belonged to the board. It had defected. Karen's voice strained. Even if there were discrepancies, you still owe the fees. This doesn't erase your violations. Marcus smiled faintly, the kind of smile that unsettles. You think this is about fees? He leaned closer, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut. It's about ownership. The crowd hushed, sensing something beyond the papers, beyond the proof. Something larger. Karen blinked, caught off guard. Ownership? This is about late payments, Mr. Marcus. Nothing more. Marcus reached into his briefcase once more. This time, he didn't pull out paper filled with accusations. He pulled out a deed. He placed it on the table with deliberate calm. The silence was absolute now, everyone leaning forward as though the room itself inhaled. This, Marcus said, tapping the page lightly, is proof of purchase. The building you're sitting in, the office you call yours. I own it now. The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, disbelieving laughter. Phones shot into the air, recording every second. The viral moment was born in an instant. Karen's face drained of color. That's not possible. Marcus met her gaze, unshaken. Check the county records, it's done. The gavel struck again, but it no longer sounded like thunder. It sounded like a desperate echo in an empty canyon. The crowd no longer feared silence. They spoke freely now. He bought the office. The HOA doesn't even own its own room. They've lost everything. The board, once confident in polished shoes and clipped tones, now looked small. Crumbling beneath the weight of their own authority, turned fragile. Marcus leaned back, letting the moment breathe. His voice cut clean through the chaos. The rules you wrote to break me now collapse under a roof I own. The room froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one breathed. The sound of papers settling on the table seemed louder than thunder. Karen's lips parted, but no words came. Her polished authority had fractured into silence. Behind her, the board members shifted uncomfortably, their pens still, their confidence drained. A voice rose from the crowd, sharp with disbelief. Wait! He owns the office? Another shouted, half in awe, half in laughter. They don't even control their own roof. The murmurs swelled into a tide. Silence had flipped. Where once it protected the board, now it drowned them. Neighbors whispered, gasped, even laughed. The crowd, once their shield, had turned into their judge. Karen's gavel struck again, desperate. This hearing is not valid. This has nothing to do with... Marcus interrupted, his voice calm, cutting clean through the noise. It has everything to do with it. You thought power meant paper, but power is ownership, and now the ground beneath your chairs is mine. The crowd reacted with gasps, nervous chuckles, shifting allegiance. The sound of phones recording filled the air, the faint click of cameras, the red glow of live streams. The hearing was no longer confined to these walls. It had escaped viral, unstoppable. One board member leaned toward Karen, whispering harshly, "We can fight this legally." Marcus heard and replied aloud, "Fight all you want, but every step you take, you'll take from a building with my name on the deed." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The tension cracked into something electric. The silence that once suffocated Marcus now suffocated the board. Karen slammed the gavel again, her hand trembling. "This is out of order." Marcus leaned forward, his words soft but carrying farther than her pounding wood. "Order doesn't come from gavels. It comes from truth. And the truth is simple. You no longer stand above me. You sit under my roof." The crowd erupted. Gasps turned to cheers, whispers turned to clapping. Neighbors who once avoided Marcus now looked at him with something different: admiration, relief, even pride. Karen's eyes darted toward the door, her composure unraveling. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, her voice cracking. She tried to rise, but the weight of the moment kept her pinned. Marcus didn't move. He let the silence after her words linger, then delivered the line that would echo across screens for weeks. "Adjourn if you want. Just don't forget to turn off the lights in my building on your way out." The crowd exploded. Laughter, applause, shouts of disbelief. Phones tilted higher, recording every flicker of collapse. In that moment, the authority of the HOA wasn't just challenged. It was shattered. Neighbors who had once whispered now spoke boldly. "I knew they were corrupt. He beat them at their own game. They can't touch him now." The board looked small, almost pitiful. Their polished shoes no longer tapped with confidence but shuffled with unease. Pens that once scratched judgments lay idle, useless. Karen's voice cracked once more, barely audible above the crowd. This isn't over." Marcus smiled, faintly, his calm unnerving. "It already is." He gathered his papers slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of each page sliding into his briefcase fill the silence. When he rose, the crowd rose with him, not physically, but in spirit. Eyes that once avoided him now followed him with respect. As he walked out, the office felt different. The walls no longer loomed with the weight of oppression. They seemed smaller, weaker, already beginning to crumble under the new truth. Outside, the air was fresh, the storm gone. Neighbors spilled into the parking lot, buzzing with disbelief. Some approached him cautiously. "Marcus," one man said, shaking his head, "I've never seen anything like that." A woman added, "You did what all of us wanted to, but never dared." Marcus didn't gloat. He simply nodded, steady as ever. Silence only works until someone speaks louder. Behind him, through the glass doors, the board still sat stunned, trapped in their own collapse. The gavel lay crooked on the table, powerless. The crowd dispersed slowly, but their murmurs carried through the neighborhood, like wildfire. By nightfall, the video clips had spread across social media. Millions watched as Marcus flipped the script, turning fines into fuel, silence into applause, and late fees into ownership. The fences still stood, their shadows stretching long across the lawns. But for the first time, those shadows no longer fell on Marcus. They fell on the ones who had built them. Under the open sky, the crowd spilled into the parking lot like a tide finally allowed to move. The doors behind them breathed a new sound. Not authority, but aftershock. On the sidewalk, the fence shadows lay broken by footsteps and voices that no longer hid. A neighbor says, "You really own the building?" Marcus replies, "The doors answer for me." Phones glowed like fireflies in daylight. Clips flew outward, small and bright, stitching a path from this cul-de-sac to 1,000 screens. The gavel inside the room lay tilted, a mute instrument on a table that no longer belonged to it. Another neighbor says, "I stayed quiet because I was scared." Marcus replies, "Silence is a rule we choose." Someone adds, "Not anymore." By evening, the video was everywhere. A short, shaking frame captured the elevated board, the lowered chair, the sharp papers that reversed the air. The crowd watched themselves watching, and the echo multiplied. A teenager says, "You were calm even when they tried to cut you." Marcus replies, "Calm is a blade if you hold it steady." A whisper follows, "They've been cutting us for years." Inside, the hollow room, the board splintered in whispers. Their pens did not move, their eyes did. The polished shoes that once tapped with certainty now scuffed the floor, tracing hesitation instead of law. A board member says, We need to call counsel. Another mutters, we need to call it quits. Karen says, no one quits while the lights are on. Night fell with the crispness of a page turning. Porch lights stitched a dotted line along the street, each bulb a wary witness. The fences gleamed slick with dew, their rails no longer a single story but many. Marcus stood at his own fence with a trowel in hand. The soil felt patient, the kind that waits for the right seed and remembers who planted it. He pressed a flat of marigolds into the earth as if bright color itself could be a testimony. A neighbor says, flowers for a fight? Marcus replies, beauty is also a verdict. A kid says, they're the same color as the gavel handle. Show. The distant thunder didn't come. The storm had already been spent inside those walls. What remained was a charged quiet, not the old silence that served cruelty, but the new quiet that listens before it answers. A voice at the fence says, I'm sorry I looked away. Marcus replies, looking back is how we start. Another voice says, tell us what to do next. Morning arrived with headlines that didn't need names to be understood. Homeowner flips HOA hearing by buying their office. The clip paused. On the moment the deed hit the table, a pen beside it like a tired soldier. A reporter on a porch says, why buy the building? Marcus replies, because paper built the walls. Paper can rebuild them. The reporter asks, what happens to the board now? Under the same roof, a meeting was called. The air smelled different, less like coffee and certainty, more like dust and doubt. Chairs scraped softly as residents filled the room that had once been reserved for scolding. Karen says, this meeting will proceed according to our... A resident replies, according to whose rules? Marcus says, according to transparency. That's the first rule tonight. He had arranged the chairs in a circle, refusing the old elevation. The gavel sat in the middle like a relic broken off a statue. The doors were propped open so the street could hear, so silence could not be trapped and trained. A teenage boy says, why'd you find my mom for a lawn ornament? An older man adds, why'd you ignore the same thing at my house? Karen says, we follow guidelines. Marcus laid down folders that were not accusations but mirrors. Each page showed a date and a choice. Each choice had a pattern that drew itself in ink. The crowd leaned closer, and in the leaning became something braver. A resident says, you find when you could, and looked away when you wanted. Karen replies, whine, we acted in good faith. Marcus says, faith is what people give you after you show your receipts. The pen in his hand did not tremble. He signed a notice placing a moratorium on selective enforcement until an independent review, and the room exhaled as if a tight shoe had finally been unlaced. The gavel remained untouched. A board member says, you can't just suspend. Marcus replies, I can suspend what I own. The law can test me if it likes. A neighbor says, and we can vote what we live. Flashback cut. His father, on a porch with a ledger and a tired smile. The man's fingers tapped the paper like a metronome for endurance. They count on you to fold your page, son, the father said. You count on yourself to turn it. Back in the circle, the crowd hummed with voices finding their pitch. The fence outside cast a grid of light across the floor, thin bars that turned into ladders as the sun moved. The symbol had not vanished. It had changed its job. A young mother says, I paid 3 fines I shouldn't have. A retired teacher adds, I didn't pay because I was friends with a board member. Marcus replies, we will refund what was taken by discretion, not by rule. He outlined a plan like a map printed on clear glass. Independent audits, public, minutes, recorded votes, randomized compliance checks that spared no friend and punished no enemy. The crowd nodded, then spoke, then nodded again. Karen says, you're turning this into a courtroom. Marcus replies, I'm turning it into a neighborhood. A voice near the door says, about time. The first resignation came gently, like a leaf dislodging in a soft breeze. A board member stood, folded a sheet in half, and left it on the table beside the silent Gavel. The second resignation came sharper, paper scraping wood with a sound, like a zipper closing. A board member says, "I'm done." Another adds, "I'm sorry." Karen says, "Cowards." The crowd didn't cheer, they breathed. The applause, when it came, was low and steady, a sound for rebuilding rather than revenge. The pen wrote names into a temporary committee, not heroes, just neighbors. A man with paint-stained cuffs says, "I never liked meetings." A nurse replies, "Me neither, but I like refunds." Marcus says, "We'll like fairness more." The video of this open circle traveled almost as fast as the deed reveal. People watched chairs facing each other instead of a dais facing down. They watched the gavel go untouched. They watched the doors stay open, the fence shadows inching across the floor like clock hands. A commenter on a live stream says, "This is how you fix power." Another types, "He didn't just win, he changed the room." A third adds, "What if every HOA did this?" By late afternoon, the office felt lighter. The light itself seemed to relax, no longer pressing hard against the walls. The pens clicked shut as if satisfied that their points had been used for building instead of bruising. Karen remained, chin high, eyes flinty. She looked at the deed, copy framed near the door, and then at Marcus as if measuring a distance she could no longer cross. Pride can be a fence without a gate. Karen says, "You humiliated us." Marcus replies, "I made the room honest." She says, "You enjoyed it." He let that accusation hang, then set it down gently. Vindication had a taste, but he refused to live on it. He chose water over salt. Marcus replies, "I enjoyed the truth winning." Karen says, "You think people will forgive you for embarrassing them?" Marcus says, "I'm asking them to forgive you for finding them." Outside, the cul-de-sac felt different under the same sun. A few neighbors crossed lawns instead of staying on sidewalks, as if the grass itself had lowered its guard. Someone tied a yellow ribbon on a mailbox. Someone else untied a knot in their throat. A boy on a bike says, "My mom smiled today." His friend replies, "Mine laughed for real." The kid adds, "The fence looks smaller." At home, Marcus washed the soil from his hands and checked the marigolds. They held their color against the afternoon, bright witnesses planted in a line where paper once cast a longer shadow. He touched a petal, like one touches a word before speaking it aloud. A journalist at the gate says, "You changed more than a fee." Marcus replies, "Late fees taught me about late truths." She asks, "Will you run the board now?" He shook his head, a refusal shaped like humility rather than fear. Power. Unlearned is power remade. Power hoarded is the same song in a different key. Marcus says, "I'll run the room, not the people." The journalist asks, "And if they come after you?" He replies, "They'll have to find a silence I don't live in." The independent auditors arrived within the week. They brought no drama, only daylight, and daylight has a way of finding everything it needs. Ledgers opened like shutters. Minutes unrolled like fresh sod. An auditor says, "There are refunds due." A resident replies, "There are apologies due." Marcus says, "We will write both." Refund envelopes went out with a note that did not hide behind adjectives. The text was simple and exact, like a fence rebuilt with even posts. "We find you when we should have reviewed, and we ignored others when we should have enforced. Here is what returns." A resident says, "I never thought I'd see this day." Another replies, "I thought I'd be gone before fairness got here." Marcus says, "Fairness arrives when we stop waiting and build the road." The crowd, always a character, always in motion, leaned into new habits. They attended, they questioned, they spoke in sentences that began with "we" more often than "they." Their whispers found a different job and didn't miss the old one. Soft-voiced neighbor says, "I'm not afraid of them anymore." A louder voice answers, "I'm not afraid of us either." Marcus says, "Fear is a tool we return." One afternoon, in a room no longer arranged like a small courtroom, Karen stood to speak with a paper that wasn't a ticket. The hush that met her was not the obedient kind, it was the listening kind. Both are quiet, but only one is capable of change. Karen says, "I resign." A resident replies, "Do you also apologize?" She says, "I apologize for the harm my decisions caused." Applause rose like a tide hitting a beam and settling beneath it. No jeers, no demands for spectacle. The gavel remained where it had been left, a wooden memory that could still be used but perhaps never again needed. Marcus says, "Thank you." Karen says, "You don't have to." He replies, "Forgiveness is also governance." A mild evening, the neighborhood gathered at the fence line where marigolds shook light from their petals. Folding tables held lemonade and forms for committee rotations. Kids chalked hopscotch squares that hopped over the shadow rails and kept going. A grandmother says, "We kept waiting for someone official." A college student replies, "Turns out that was us." Marcus says, "Turns out the doors were always ours to open." A brief flashback cut landed like a soft chord. His father on that old porch tapping the ledger, smiling into a future he would not fully see. "They'll hide behind paper," the voice said again. "Right anyway." Back, in the present, a small wind knocked a notice off the bulletin board, and a kid rehung it with a magnet shaped like a flower. The symbol didn't brag. It simply held the page in place so words could do their work. A neighbor says, "Do you miss the fight?" Marcus replies, "I prefer the build." Another asks, "What if they try to rebuild the old way?" He looked down the street where fence shadows fell short of the chalk lines. He looked at the office door propped open, the hinge no longer creaking like a secret. He looked at the crowd, a living quorum with no corners. Marcus says, "Then we meet them, at the door. With paper that protects, with silence that listens, with pens that sign us in." The pen he lifted was the same shape as before, but a different instrument in his hand. He wrote a final line into the minutes for the day, a sentence that folded, the beginning into the end, and left a space for what comes next. The air seemed to lean closer to hear it. He spoke toward the fence that once divided and now framed a garden. He spoke toward the door that once shut and now stayed open like a lesson. He spoke toward the crowd that once watched and now moved. Marcus says, "When rules are written against you, the first line you change is the one that tells you to be quiet." The camera in someone's palm caught the marigolds in the same frame as the deed on the office wall. The clip would loop later with a caption that didn't beg for views, it asked for courage. The crowd murmured, not as an ending, but as a beginning, with good shoes on. He let the moment settle like dust choosing a windowsill. He let the silence breathe like a chest that had been held too long. Then he closed the book gently, not like a victory lap, but like a door that could be opened again without force. The fence still cast its line across the grass. The difference was not in the shadow, but in the hands that worked the soil around it. The paper still bore ink. The difference was not in the pen, but in the promises under it. He turned to the camera as if turning to a mirror that belongs to all of us. His voice did not rise. It reached. The marigolds held their color like witnesses who attend every hearing, even the ones inside us. He says, "This began with a fence and a piece of paper. It ends with a room full of voices and a door left open. The choice is left with us. Comment your answer below.